G'day everyone, Viv here from Battle Bunker down in Melbourne. I got a comment on the channel from Warhammer Ricky. He asked for, here's the comment, he asked for how do I make goop. Goop is very simple. Goop is basically a plaster based mix of different sorts of stuff. The goop that I use for doing things on the bases like this ruin, etc. that I've used different sorts of goop recipes for different sorts of things. There is no one standard recipe for goop. It's basically just a mixture of different sorts of stuff to create that texture on the ground for different sorts of textures. So got some sawdust here. This is sort of like a coarse sawdust. Sand. This is plumber's sand. This has a slightly thicker grain than normal washed sand. This is not beach sand, this is bagged sand from the hardware store. Excuse me, I'm not well at the moment. I prefer the plumber's sand for basing figures and all that sort of stuff because of its irregularity. It's $7 for like 10 kilograms or something like that. It's ridiculous. It's the cheapest basing material I've ever used, and it's the best material I've ever used. If you can get hold of it, it's fantastic. I don't think you should have a problem. And finally but not last, a very fine sawdust. Now, both of the sawdusts that I've shown you, both the thick and the sort of the fine grain, I buy in very large sacks. It's very, very cheap. The fine grain sawdust, which is what they call a sawdust flour, is probably, I think it was $12 for this bag. And the larger grain sawdust, which is actually sawdust, I think was $9 for this bag. Oh, coincidentally, I also use the sawdust here to make different sorts of flocks by tinting it with different coloured paints or different sorts of coloured inks. But we'll talk about that later on. Essentially, a goop mix is taking a cup, adding to it some plaster, some water, some glue, one of these types of ingredients. I add some black paint and some acrylic gap filler that you squeeze out in one of these guns for sealing gaps, etc. Excuse me. This adds a little bit of flexibility, especially if you're using like something like plaster of Paris as your plaster base. I'm going to be using casting plaster, which comes in big 20 kilogram bags, but I'm sure you could probably buy it in smaller quantities. It's just cheaper to buy things in bigger bags like that. So that's what I'll be using, just some casting plaster. Now I've had this stuff for 4 years and it still works fine. I bought the 20 kilogram bag back then for $24, I think. And I've cast so much stuff. Anyway, let's get into it. A quick little demonstration. I'll show you on the other side of this building here the different sorts of effect that you'll get by adding one of these ingredients. Making this goop's recipe is fairly straightforward. The first thing that I do is add some acrylic caulking mix. I use this one from Bostik, but I'm sure you'll be able to find something wherever. It's just an acrylic gap filler. It's like a silicone. I add a little bit of that to some water. Obviously the quantity that you're mixing up is sort of going to have to be gauged by you. There's no recipe that I use. I'm just going to be gooping the side of this building here. So I'm just going to mix up a small amount, and that's probably going to be a little bit too much water for what we need. I'm just going to get rid of a little bit of it. Bugger it. Oh, come on, crikey. Oh, slowly it wants to get out of there. Then I just squeeze in a sort of like a 1 or 2 pulls of the trigger on this thing here, and sort of you'll end up with a little sausage sort of in the bottom of the cup there. That's got to go in first, and it's got to be blended into the water first before anything else. And it's just a matter of mixing that up. Okay, I'm making a bit of a mess at the moment, but once that's sort of blended in, excuse me, then I go ahead and add some white glue, some PVA. This just, I don't know why I add it. It's just, I can understand why adding this filler here the caulking would help. That's going to help give the piece a little bit of flexibility, especially because the plaster is a brittle substance when it's dry. The glue, I don't know, I just add glue because it's glue, man, add glue. I add a little bit of black paint. Excuse me, this coughing is terrible. I add a little bit of black paint so that when I paint the goop on, it's coloured grey. I can see where I'm painting it. I don't like this bottle here. It's exploded on me before the cap's come off and paint's gone spraying everywhere and punk! Explosions happen. There's great big gusts of paint go flying in there. It's horrible. It wasn't a pleasant experience. It was quite funny actually, but it really wasn't that bad. I just need a little bit of paint. Mix that in there. Now I start adding all my dry substances. First I add my plaster, and again with the plaster, adding in the plaster and the plaster mixes. It's all done by eye. I just add plaster in here basically until it's all settled into the bottom. Oh, excuse me. You want the final sort of thickness of this goop mix. Well, this is the way that I do it anyway. Like I said, it's just a concoction of different sorts of stuff to be something kind of like a toothpaste. And I achieve that by a combination of adding in my plaster, which sets everything together, and my texture. And in this case, I'm using the sawdust, the coarser grade of the two that I showed you before. So I don't know how much plaster I had in there, but for the observant people, you'll be able to see how much I've added. Oh, excuse me. And we mix all of this up. Oh, lovely. I really should put a carpet down here. Then I'm going to add a little bit of sawdust. Yeah, a couple of 2 pinches maybe. Whatever a pinch is. Look it up on Wikipedia, I'm sure they'll tell you what a pinch is. So here's what we got so far. A bit more sawdust, thicken it up a little bit more. So this goop mix, good for heavy basing, etc., where you need that sort of rubble sort of effect, kind of like this one. And once you've got your mix prepared, make sure if you're using tools like this one, I'm using a metal spoon. Clean it because the plaster will dry on there, then it's hard to get that clean. Then all we need here is, I had a brush over here before. It's interesting. Here it is. All we need then is a fairly coarse sort of brush, and it's just a matter of gooping this mix on here. Again, using stippling techniques, etc. Get up on the window sills because there's going to be dirt and stuff flying around there. Doorways are generally pretty clear, but you want to goop things up around the side of the doors where traffic would be going through. And as this sets, you'll get that nice sort of undulated level and the dry brushable texture of whatever sort of mix you've added in there. So that's really all I needed, and there you go. Yeah, you can see that sort of effect it's going to have. So there we go, Warhammer Ricky. Nice and quick and simple. Excuse me. All you need to do is vary the basing material that you use to get a different type of effect. Otherwise it's pretty much the same. Water, some sort of acrylic caulking, plaster, glue, a little bit of black paint that I use so it tinges it grey, and then your sort of additive that you want to use for texture. Thanks guys, thanks for watching, thanks Warhammer Ricky for the question. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Take care, see ya. Just like that, punk!